Zane Morrison didn't think much of the job when the call came in. A short circuit in a socket at a mansion on the edge of town. An ordinary task, and as an electrician he'd handled worse. But nothing prepared him for what he would encounter the moment he stepped inside the sprawling estate of billionaire Sebastian Hale. The mansion itself was an architectural masterpiece, a blend of classical elegance and modern innovation. Towering pillars framed the entrance, and intricate carvings adorned the massive oak doors. Zane couldn't help but gawk as he walked up the driveway, his toolbox in hand. The mansion screamed wealth and power, but something about it also felt wrong. The housekeeper, a petite woman with nervous eyes, greeted him at the door. "You're here for the outlet?" she asked hurriedly. "Yes, ma'am. Where's the issue?" "This way." Her voice was shaky as she led him down a long, dimly lit corridor. Despite the mansion's grandeur, the halls seemed cold, almost lifeless. Zane noticed the faint hum of hidden security cameras and the sterile scent of recently cleaned floors. As they entered a grand sitting room, the housekeeper paused, pointing to a far corner where a lone antique lamp sat atop a mahogany side table. "There, the outlet's behind that." Zane nodded and got to work. The wiring seemed older than the mansion itself, which was unusual. He was just about to replace a faulty component when he heard it. A faint whisper. "Help me." Zane froze. The voice was soft, almost ethereal, and it came from behind the wall. "Did you hear that?" he asked, turning to the housekeeper. She looked at him like he'd just grown a second head. "Hear what?" "That voice," he said, gesturing to the wall. The housekeeper's face paled. "I don't know what you're talking about. Just fix the outlet and leave. Quickly." But Zane couldn't let it go. He pressed his ear to the wall, and there it was again, more distinct this time. A desperate plea. "Help me, please." He stood, heart pounding, and examined the wall. There was something off about it. The wallpaper didn't align perfectly, and when he tapped on the surface, it gave a hollow sound. "Sir, I think you should go," the housekeeper said, her voice rising with panic. Ignoring her, Zane grabbed a small flashlight from his toolbox and began inspecting the edges of the wall. That's when he noticed it. A faint seam, almost invisible, running vertically along the plaster. "This isn't just a wall," he muttered to himself. The housekeeper took a step back. "You shouldn't mess with that. Mr. Hale doesn't like people prying." Zane glanced at her, the urgency in her voice making his curiosity burn even hotter. "What's behind here?" Her eyes darted to the hallway, and she lowered her voice. "I don't know, and I don't want to know. You shouldn't either." But Zane wasn't listening. He reached into his toolbox and pulled out a pry bar. With a few careful motions, he pried the seam open just enough to reveal a hidden door. "What the hell?" The housekeeper gasped, backing away as Zane opened the door to reveal a narrow staircase descending into darkness. A cold draft wafted up, carrying with it a faint metallic tang. "Don't go down there," she whispered, but Zane couldn't resist. Flashlight in hand, he stepped onto the first creaky step, his breath visible in the chill. Each step groaned under his weight as he descended, the darkness growing thicker with every footfall. At the bottom of the stairs, the narrow passage opened into a cavernous room lit by a single, flickering bulb. The walls were lined with strange devices. Monitors displaying incomprehensible data, jars filled with murky liquids, and photographs pinned to a corkboard, each one marked with dates and scribbled notes. In the center of the room stood a glass enclosure, and inside it, Zane's stomach churned as he approached. A young woman, pale and frail, sat on the floor of the glass cage. Her eyes darted to him, wide with terror. "Help me," she croaked. Zane staggered back, his mind racing. What was this? Why was she here? Before he could react, the sound of footsteps echoed from the stairs behind him. He turned to see a tall man in a tailored suit descending, his expression calm but his eyes cold as ice. "You shouldn't be here," the man said, his voice like a razor blade. Zane swallowed hard, the flashlight trembling in his hand. What is this? Who is she? Sebastian Hale stepped fully into the room, his lips curling into a predatory smile. You're quite the curious one, aren't you, Mr. Morrison? Perhaps a little too curious for your own good. The door at the top of the stairs slammed shut, locking with an ominous click. Zane's breath quickened as Sebastian Hale loomed before him, the man's imposing presence amplified by the eerie glow of the flickering bulb. The young woman in the glass enclosure clutched her knees, her wide eyes pleading with Zane. What is this place? Zane demanded, his voice unsteady. Sebastian tilted his head, his cold smile never wavering. A room for experiments. My work requires discretion, and sometimes discretion demands unconventional measures. Experiments, Zane repeated, his voice rising. She's a person, not some lab rat. Sebastian's smile faded. Careful, Mr. Morrison. You're trespassing now, and I don't take kindly to trespassers. The air between them felt like it might crackle under the weight of the tension. Zane's mind raced, calculating his next move. The door behind him was locked, and Sebastian blocked the only way out. I didn't sign up for this, Zane muttered, glancing at the trembling woman. No, you didn't, Sebastian said, stepping closer. But here you are, in my sanctuary, meddling where you don't belong. You've seen too much, Mr. Morrison. Zane's hands curled into fists. He wasn't a fighter, but he wasn't about to let this man intimidate him either. If you don't let her go, I'm calling the cops. Sebastian chuckled darkly, the sound echoing ominously in the cavernous room. Do you really think I'd let you walk out of here with a story like that? Before Zane could respond, a loud metallic clang echoed from the ceiling, followed by a low rumble. The room shuddered, and the lights flickered. What the hell was that? Zane asked, his eyes darting to the ceiling. Sebastian's expression tightened. For the first time, a flicker of unease crossed his face. It seems our time is up. Follow me, Mr. Morrison, unless you'd like to be buried alive. Zane hesitated, torn between staying to help the woman and the very real danger of the unstable room. The woman's hoarse voice broke his indecision. Go. Save yourself. Ignoring her plea, Zane took a step closer to the glass cage. I'm not leaving without you. Sebastian sighed and pressed a button on the wall. With a loud hiss, a section of the floor slid open, revealing a staircase leading even deeper into the mansion's foundations. Fine. Have it your way. You've chosen the hard path. Two burly men appeared at the top of the staircase, their faces shadowed but their menacing intent clear. Secure him, Sebastian barked. Zane's heart sank as the men approached. Wait, don't. Before he could finish, one of the guards grabbed him by the arms, pinning him in place. Zane struggled, but the man's grip was like iron. Place him in the cells, Sebastian ordered. No, let me go, Zane shouted, thrashing against his captor. As the second guard reached for him, the young woman in the cage suddenly screamed, her voice raw and piercing. The sound startled everyone, giving Zane just enough of a distraction to break free. He elbowed the guard in the ribs and lunged for the button Sebastian had pressed earlier. With a desperate push, Zane slammed his hand against the button. A loud hiss filled the air as the glass cage began to slide open. The young woman scrambled to her feet, her movements frantic. Run! Zane yelled, grabbing her hand. The woman stumbled out of the cage, her legs weak from confinement, but Zane pulled her toward the staircase that had just been revealed. Behind them, Sebastian roared in anger. Stop them! The guards lunged, but Zane and the woman were already racing down the hidden staircase. The walls narrowed around them, the air growing colder and damper with every step. What's down here? Zane asked, his voice echoing in the tunnel. The woman panted, barely able to keep up. I don't know. I've never been this far. He keeps most of his victims upstairs. Victims? Zane echoed, his blood running cold. He calls them experiments, she whispered. But it's torture. People come here and never leave. I thought I was going to die in that cage. Zane tightened his grip on her hand. Not today. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. Heavy footsteps pounded on the stairs, and Sebastian's voice echoed through the tunnel. You can't escape me, Mr. Morrison. The only way out is through me. Zane ignored him, focusing on the path ahead. The tunnel twisted and turned, the walls slick with condensation. Finally, they reached a heavy steel door. Can you open it? The woman asked, her voice trembling. Zane examined the door, his electrician's instincts kicking in. There was a keypad and a fingerprint scanner. I'll need time. Keep watch. As the woman turned to face the tunnel, Zane pulled a screwdriver from his belt and began working on the panel. His hands shook as he pried open the cover, exposing a mess of wires. Come on, he muttered, splicing wires together with practiced precision. Suddenly, the woman gasped. They're here. Zane glanced back to see Sebastian and his guards closing in, their faces grim. Desperation surged through him as he connected the final wire. With a soft beep, the door unlocked. Go, he shouted, pushing the woman through the doorway. He followed her just as the guards reached them, slamming the door shut and locking it from the inside. They found themselves in a new corridor, this one lined with unmarked doors. The air was even colder, and the faint hum of machinery filled the silence. What is this place? The woman whispered, her voice barely audible. Zane didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the door at the end of the corridor. It was different from the others. Heavier, reinforced, and adorned with a symbol he didn't recognize. This isn't over, he muttered, his resolve hardening. The heavy door at the end of the corridor loomed like a sentinel, its strange, unfamiliar symbol gleaming under the dim, fluorescent lights. Zane's instincts screamed at him to turn back, but he couldn't. Not now, not after what he'd seen. Beside him, the young woman, whose name he still didn't know, clutched his arm, her trembling fingers betraying the fear she was trying to suppress. What's behind that door? Zane asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head. I don't know. No one does. It's forbidden. Even the guards won't go near it. Forbidden? Zane muttered, staring at the symbol. It looked like a crest or insignia, circular with jagged lines intersecting in strange, almost hypnotic patterns. The sound of footsteps echoed from the corridor they had just fled, snapping them both out of their daze. They're coming, she whispered, her voice taut with panic. Zane glanced back, his mind racing. They had no choice but to go forward. Stay behind me, he said, his tone more confident than he felt. He approached the door and inspected it. Like the others, it was locked with a keypad, but this one also had an old-fashioned keyhole. Strange, he thought. Why use such advanced security and then rely on something as rudimentary as a physical key? Can you pick a lock? He asked her. She shook her head, her eyes wide. No. Can you? Zane grimaced. Not really, but I can improvise. Reaching into his toolbox, he pulled out a pair of pliers and a flathead screwdriver. His hands worked quickly, the adrenaline sharpening his focus. The footsteps behind them grew louder, punctuated by Sebastian's cold, calculating voice. Zane, there's no way out of this. Open that door, and you won't like what you find. Zane ignored him, his tools clinking softly against the metal. The lock finally gave way with a satisfying click, and the door creaked open. A rush of stale, cold air greeted them, carrying a faint chemical odor that made his stomach churn. Go, Zane urged, pulling the woman through the doorway. They entered a cavernous space, larger than any of the other rooms they had seen. The walls were lined with towering shelves, each one filled with strange artifacts. Antique weapons, glowing vials of liquid, and devices that looked like they belonged in a sci-fi movie. At the center of the room was a massive cylindrical chamber encased in glass. Thick cables snaked across the floor, connecting the chamber to a network of humming machines. Inside the chamber was something that made Zane's blood run cold. It was a man, or what was left of one. His body was gaunt, his skin translucent, revealing veins that pulsed with an unnatural blue light. His eyes were closed, but his chest rose and fell in shallow, mechanical breaths. What is this?" Zane whispered, stepping closer. The woman gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "I don't know. I've never seen anything like it." The sound of the door slamming shut behind them made them both spin around. Sebastian Hale stood in the doorway, flanked by his two guards. His expression was calm, but his eyes burned with a quiet fury. "You should have stayed out of this, Mr. Morrison," Sebastian said, his voice like ice. "You've forced my hand." "What the hell is going on here?" Zane demanded, pointing to the man in the chamber. "What are you doing to these people?" Sebastian stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the cold floor. "You're standing in the heart of progress," he said, gesturing to the room. "Every breakthrough humanity has ever achieved came at a cost. This is mine." "That's not progress," Zane snapped. "That's torture." Sebastian smirked. "You're naive. Do you think innovation comes without sacrifice? These experiments, they're necessary. Without them, I couldn't secure the future." "The future of what?" Zane asked, his voice rising. Sebastian's eyes gleamed with something akin to madness. "Immortality," he said simply. The word hung in the air like a dagger. "You're insane," Zane said, taking a step back. "You're playing God." Sebastian laughed, the sound echoing ominously in the cavernous room. "God has nothing to do with it. This is science. Pure, unbridled science." The man in the chamber stirred, his eyelids fluttering. Zane and the woman froze, their eyes locked on him as his lips parted, forming a single rasping word. "Run." Sebastian's smile vanished, replaced by a scowl. "Shut it down," he barked at one of the guards. The guard rushed to a nearby console, but before he could reach it, the chamber began to shake. Alarms blared, and the machines hissed as steam vented from their pipes. "What's happening?" the woman cried, clutching Zane's arm. "I don't know," he admitted, his eyes darting around the room. The man in the chamber suddenly opened his eyes, revealing irises that glowed the same unnatural blue as his veins. He let out a guttural scream, and the glass of the chamber shattered, shards flying in every direction. Sebastian stumbled back, his expression a mix of rage and fear. "Stop him," he shouted. But it was too late. The man, or whatever he had become, stepped out of the chamber, his movements jerky and unnatural. The room seemed to tremble with each step he took, the machines around him sparking and failing. Zane grabbed the woman's hand. "We need to get out of here. Now." They bolted for the opposite end of the room, dodging falling debris and sparking wires. Behind them, the creature let out another inhuman scream, and Zane risked a glance back to see it lunging toward one of the guards. "Don't stop," Zane shouted, pulling the woman through a narrow passageway that led away from the chaos. The sound of destruction faded as they ran, replaced by the pounding of their own hearts. When they finally reached a dead end, Zane leaned against the wall, gasping for breath. "What was that thing?" the woman asked, her voice shaking. "I don't know," Zane admitted, wiping sweat from his brow. "But whatever it is, we need to make sure it doesn't follow us." The air in the narrow passage was suffocating, heavy with the metallic tang of blood and burning machinery. Zane leaned against the cold stone wall, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. Beside him, the woman, whose name he still didn't know, gripped his arm like a lifeline, her pale face streaked with dirt and fear. "What just happened back there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the ringing in Zane's ears. "I don't know," he replied, his voice trembling. "But whatever Sebastian's been doing, it's way beyond anything I've ever seen." The ground shuddered beneath their feet, a low rumble that made the walls tremble. Somewhere far behind them, the inhuman screeches of the creature echoed through the labyrinth. Zane couldn't tell if the sounds were getting closer or fading, but every nerve in his body screamed that they weren't safe. "We can't stay here," he said, pulling himself upright. The woman nodded, her eyes wide with terror. "Where do we go?" Zane glanced around, his flashlight beam bouncing off the slick walls. The passage was narrow and twisting, and there was no telling where it led, or if it even had an exit. "We follow the tunnel. It has to lead somewhere." As they moved deeper into the maze, the air grew colder, each breath forming visible puffs in the dim light. The walls were lined with strange etchings, symbols and patterns that seemed to pulse faintly with a sickly green glow. "Do you see that?" the woman asked, pointing to the markings. "Yeah," Zane muttered. "Let's not touch anything." The tunnel opened into another chamber, smaller than the last but no less unsettling. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and atop it was an object that immediately drew Zane's attention. A small, black cube, its surface etched with the same glowing symbols. "What is that?" the woman asked, taking a cautious step forward. "I don't know," Zane said, his instincts screaming at him to stay back. The cube seemed to hum faintly, a low vibration that resonated in Zane's chest. He could feel it pulling at him, an almost magnetic force that made his fingers itch to reach out and touch it. "Don't," the woman warned, as if sensing his thoughts. "I wasn't going to," he lied, forcing himself to look away. Before they could move, the walls of the chamber shook violently, and the sound of crumbling stone filled the air. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling as the creature's guttural roar echoed through the tunnels. "It's coming," she said, her voice rising in panic. Zane scanned the room, searching for another exit. There was a narrow opening on the far side, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "This way." They darted toward the opening, but as they reached it, a deafening crash stopped them in their tracks. The creature burst through the wall behind them, its glowing eyes locking onto Zane with an intensity that made his blood run cold. The thing that had once been a man was now a nightmare, a skeletal figure with elongated limbs and veins that pulsed with an eerie blue light. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. "Go!" Zane shouted, shoving the woman toward the narrow opening. She hesitated for a split second before squeezing through, disappearing into the darkness beyond. Zane turned back to face the creature, his heart pounding. He grabbed a length of pipe from the ground, holding it like a makeshift weapon. "You want me?" he said, his voice shaking. "Come and get me." The creature let out a piercing screech and lunged at him with terrifying speed. Zane swung the pipe with all his strength, connecting with the thing's arm. The impact sent a jolt up his arms, but the creature barely flinched. Zane stumbled back, realizing too late that he was outmatched. The creature's claws swiped at him, grazing his shoulder and tearing through his shirt. Pain flared, but adrenaline kept him moving. Desperate, Zane hurled the pipe at the pedestal, striking the glowing cube. The object wobbled and fell to the floor, shattering into 1,000 pieces. The effect was immediate. The creature froze, its movements jerking to a halt as if an invisible force had seized it. For a moment, the chamber was eerily silent. Then the creature let out a blood-curdling scream, its body convulsing violently. The blue light in its veins flickered and faded, and it collapsed to the ground, motionless. Zane didn't wait to see if it would get back up. He turned and scrambled through the narrow opening, his shoulder burning with pain. The passage on the other side was even darker and narrower, but he could hear the woman's footsteps ahead of him. "Are you okay?" she called back, her voice echoing in the tight space. "Barely," he said, his breath ragged. They emerged into another chamber, this one completely different from the others. The walls were smooth and metallic, and the air was filled with the faint hum of machinery. A massive console stood at the center, its surface covered in blinking lights and holographic displays. "What is this place?" the woman asked, staring at the console in awe. Zane approached it cautiously, his fingers brushing over the controls. "It's some kind of command center." Before he could examine it further, A voice crackled through a hidden speaker. "You've done well, Mr. Morrison," Sebastian said, his tone eerily calm. Zane froze. "Sebastian, I must admit, I underestimated you," the billionaire continued. "But you've proven resourceful, and that's a quality I value." "Where are you?" Zane demanded, scanning the room. "Closer than you think," Sebastian replied. "But the real question is, what will you do now? That console can unlock secrets you can't even begin to comprehend. Or it can destroy everything you've seen tonight." Zane's fingers hovered over the controls, his mind racing. "Why are you doing this?" Sebastian chuckled. "Because power, Mr. Morrison, belongs to those who dare to seize it. The choice is yours. Make it wisely." The line went dead, leaving Zane and the woman alone in the chamber. She looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "What do we do?" she asked. Zane stared at the console, the weight of Sebastian's words pressing down on him. Zane's hands hovered over the console, trembling as he weighed his options. The holographic display glowed with an eerie light, the commands labeled in cryptic terms that offered no clear answers. The woman stood beside him, her voice shaking. "Zane, whatever you do, make sure it ends this nightmare." Sebastian's words echoed in his mind. The console can unlock secrets, or destroy everything you've seen tonight. Was this a bluff, another manipulation from a man who thrived on control? Or was it the truth? "Stay back," Zane told her, his voice firmer than he felt. The room suddenly shuddered, and from the passage they had just emerged from came the distant roar of the creature they thought was defeated. The glow of its blue veins illuminated the dark tunnel, a terrifying reminder that time was running out. "I thought it was dead," the woman cried. "So did I," Zane muttered, panic rising. Sebastian's voice crackled over the speaker again, colder this time. "Ah, my experiment isn't so easily undone, Mr. Morrison. You can't win this." Zane slammed his fist against the console in frustration. "You call this winning? Torturing people? Playing God?" Sebastian laughed, the sound sending chills down their spines. "You're still thinking too small. Sacrifices must be made for progress. But I'm done explaining myself to you. Goodbye, Mr. Morrison." The speaker went silent, and the room's lights flickered ominously. The creature's guttural screams grew louder, closer. "We don't have time," the woman shouted, pulling at Zane's arm. "Just do something." Zane's eyes darted between the commands on the console. None of them were clear, but one caught his attention. "System purge." "This might do it," he said, his fingers hovering over the option. "What does it mean?" she asked, her voice filled with fear. "It means taking a risk," he replied, swallowing hard. The creature burst into the room, its elongated limbs smashing through the metallic walls like paper. Its glowing eyes locked onto Zane, its mouth opening in a horrifying, unnatural screech. "Do it now," the woman screamed. Zane slammed his hand down on the system purge command. The console emitted a loud, high-pitched tone, and the entire room seemed to vibrate. A cascade of red lights flashed across the displays, and a robotic voice announced, "System purge initiated. Facility will self-destruct in 60 seconds. "What? You're blowing it up?" she yelled. "Would you rather let that thing keep chasing us?" Zane shot back, grabbing her hand. "Come on, we need to move." They bolted for the nearest door, the creature roaring in fury as the facility's systems began to implode. Sparks flew from the walls, and the ground beneath them shook violently. The passage twisted and turned, the tremors making it harder to keep their balance. Debris rained down around them, but they pressed on, the countdown blaring over the facility's intercom. 40 seconds. The creature was still behind them, smashing through walls in its relentless pursuit. "We're not going to make it," the woman cried. "There's always a way," Zane shouted, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. They reached a large steel door marked emergency exit. Zane grabbed the lever and pulled with all his strength. The door creaked but didn't budge. "Come on," he growled, throwing his weight against it. The woman joined him, and together they forced the door open just enough to squeeze through. On the other side was a narrow staircase leading upward. 20 seconds. Climb! Zane yelled, pushing her ahead of him. They scrambled up the stairs, each second feeling like an eternity. The creature's howls grew distant, drowned out by the sound of explosions ripping through the facility below. They reached the top of the staircase, bursting through another door into the cool night air. Behind them, the ground shuddered one final time, and with a deafening roar, the mansion erupted in a fiery explosion. The force of the blast knocked them to the ground. Zane shielded the woman with his body as debris rained down around them. For a long moment, there was only silence, save for the crackling of flames in the distance. Zane rolled onto his back, staring up at the night sky, his chest heaving. Did we do it? The woman asked, her voice trembling. Zane sat up, surveying the wreckage. The mansion was gone, reduced to a smoldering ruin. I think so. The woman let out a shaky laugh, tears streaming down her face. It's over. Zane wasn't so sure. He stood, helping her to her feet. We need to make sure. There's no telling if Sebastian got out. As they turned to leave, the faint sound of sirens reached their ears. Police and emergency vehicles were approaching, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness. They'll ask questions, she said, her expression tense. Let them, Zane replied. Someone needs to know what happened here. For the first time since entering the mansion, Zane felt a sliver of hope. They had escaped, they had survived, and they had destroyed Sebastian's twisted operation. But as they walked toward the approaching vehicles, a cold wind swept through the night, carrying with it a faint, echoing laugh. Sebastian Hale's laugh,